Welcome back. This week we'll be talking about the 5 myths associated with postpartum, right? Which a lot of people think is just the fourth trimester in a pregnancy journey. And it's actually much longer than that. So let's talk about that a little bit. The first myth, being a chiropractor, people just kind of assume that, oh, the aches and pains that I might have experienced during my pregnancy will just kind of go away because the baby is born. And while low back pain tends to decrease after the baby is born, what tends to happen for a lot of moms is that they start to develop neck and upper back pain, what is referred to as nursing mother's neck, which is kind of like the original tech neck, right? Because you're holding your baby, your newborn, you're looking down. Does this look familiar? Like when you might be typing and mousing or looking at your phone or tablet all the time? So this started way back before phones and tablets and computers and all of that. But just looking down at your baby all the time, and I'm assuming for any mom out there who is watching this video, you probably have experienced that, your baby fell asleep. You don't really want to move your body because the baby might wake up. And so you might contort your body in all kinds of ways in order to keep the baby happy and resting and all the things. And so we tend to do a lot of awkward positions or a lot of sustained positions in a not so neutral way. So many times I get new moms coming in because their their neck is feeling uncomfortable, their mid back is feeling uncomfortable, right? Everything is in front of us. Anyway, our life is in front of us, but now you have diaper changes, you have lifting, you have feeding and carrying and holding and sleeping and all of those things in these sustained postures, which you probably didn't do before at the baby's arrival. And so we want to really make sure that we are stacking our spine, keeping our ear stacked on top of our shoulder, on top of our elbow as much as possible. That might not always be a reality when you have a baby in your arms, but after you've fed or after you've held the baby for a little bit, if you can actually think about doing what I call the face wash exercise. It's in the YouTube channel. We'll link it in our notes here. But the face wash stretch can be a really great thing to do after you nurse because you can do it seated. You don't need any kind of equipment, and it allows your head to be more stacked on top of your spine rather than in front of your body. Kind of like a bowling ball hanging off the edge of a cliff. So we want to take that pressure off of our muscles and allow our spine to support our instead. Now, myth number two, this is kind of a soapbox topic for me, so just bear with me. But a lot of times I get new parents in, particularly new parents, sometimes second or third time parents, but they come in because the baby appears to be constipated, but they have been told by their pediatrician or somebody that it is quote unquote normal. And like I like to say, there is really no symptom that I can think of that is normal, but rather that is very common. So while it's true that a breastfed baby might not have frequent bowel movements each day, what I really want to pay attention to is the comfort level for the baby, particularly when they're having a bowel movement. So does your baby arch their body backwards or their head backwards? Do they get really fussy? Do they get really irritable when they're having a bowel movement? Do they grunt or do they cry or strain? Right? Is that a easy process for them or is that a painful process for them? So while I think it's important to still look at the frequency of bowel movements, I pay more attention to what is that experience like for the baby. And one of the things that we also talk about is that if a mom is breastfeeding her baby and the baby is constipated, there can actually be a really strong connection between mom's digestion and the baby's digestion. So we start looking at how often is the mom having a bowel movement? And it might be quote unquote normal for the mom to have one bowel movement a day or every other day or a few times a week. And maybe the mom has returned to that frequency so it doesn't feel like it's alarming, but also after the baby is born, as you may experience, the focus tends to shift a lot on the baby's health, right? So if the baby's constipated or uncomfortable or colicky or fussy, the mom may not be as much paying attention to what's happening in her body and rather more focusing on what's happening in the baby's body. So in our practice, we look at what is happening for mom and baby to help really understand if that connection can be addressed by looking at mom's digestion and giving relief to the baby. That is definitely something that we have seen happen countless times and is really helpful for identifying if the mom has a sensitivity, perhaps a food sensitivity that might be challenging for the mom to digest. So even outside of maybe avoiding gluten or dairy or some of the common things, we really look at identifying what might be a specific trigger for the mom and or for the baby. And myth 3 is kind of connected in that line of if the baby is colicky or fussy or having trouble latching, a lot of times we think maybe there's something that we need to do in terms of like holding the baby a little bit more or trying to rock the baby, or sometimes we just get frustrated, right? Like if your baby's going through a witching hour, it can be really challenging to know what to do. You're just kind of waiting for the baby to outgrow that phase. But there can be a lot of connection with the baby's presentation of discomfort, along with how their spinal alignment is actually functioning or how it's aligned. So, for any kind of birth, whether it was a natural birth, vaginal births, if it was a C section, if there was forceps or vacuum, whatever the delivery process was, any kind of birth can result in some kind of birth trauma physically for the baby. But if there was a C-section or a forcep or vacuum delivery, the chances of having a misalignment in the upper neck of the baby becomes much higher, right? Because at the time of the birth, if they're doing a C-section and kind of pulling the baby out in order to help minimize the scarring for the mom, the incision has become smaller. And so trying to get the baby out of a smaller space, but also if there's forcep or vacuum, but even just a vaginal birth, right? Just pulling the baby from the mom can result in some misalignments for the baby's upper neck, particularly. And so I always encourage my practice members to have their newborns checked as well as early as they feel comfortable by a certified pediatric chiropractor. And the link is below to find a pediatric chiropractor near you through the ICPA website, so that you have a chiropractor who is qualified and trained in assessing a newborn and checking for spinal misalignments to see if that might be contributing to not only their presentation, but also if we can optimize their health and wellness right from the get go. So, with that, we're going to talk about myth number 4, which goes back to the mom. And this was something that I hadn't really thought about when I had my first daughter, and that was the amount of hair loss around month 4 or 5 after the baby is born, right? We often experience really, really great hair during our pregnancy. The hormones, the prenatal supplements that you might be taking, all of those things tend to lead to an experience of much better hair, much better nails and skin during the pregnancy. And then what happens for so many women is that they just finish off the bottle of prenatal vitamins, or as I mentioned earlier, the focus and all the energy tends to go towards making sure that the baby is happy and healthy, and the shift away from mom's needs and well-being tends to go pretty much all to the baby then, right? So looking at mom's nutritional health, so that can be just making sure that you're getting appropriate nutrients in, ideally through food, as well as getting the appropriate supplements in. We can have a whole other conversation about appropriate supplements, but making sure that you're getting the right nutrients, but also looking at how well you're breaking down those nutrients. So, while a lot of people talk about the diet and what you should be eating and what you should be avoiding, I really focus a lot on how are you digesting those nutrients, because a lot of women, even outside of postpartum or pregnancy itself, a lot of women have trouble breaking down protein and fat. And so we really want to make sure that you are breaking down and digesting appropriately. So we talked about baby being constipated earlier, but when it comes to digestive health, ideal digestive health would be one bowel movement for every meal that you're eating as an adult, right? For newborns, this is not really the case. They're not going to necessarily have a bowel movement for every time they feed, but for an adult, or once we start transitioning the baby to solids and they're eating exclusively solids, this is something I would really want you to pay attention to as a parent, is how often is your child having a bowel movement, because it's much easier to address this when we're young and we don't have years of patterns built into our system. We can still address it in adulthood, but it just takes a little bit more time because we have to retrain functions in our body to respond accordingly. So when it comes to hair loss, if you want to avoid having to sweep all that up, and I mentioned this to my hairdresser after my first pregnancy, and she said, "Oh yeah, this is a thing because this is why so many moms get shorter haircuts." And I had thought it was happening because otherwise, the baby will grab your hair and do all those things. And she said, "Well, that's probably also factoring into it." She said, "But so many of her clients were experiencing hair loss around this 4, 5 month postpartum time that they were starting to get much shorter haircuts so that they wouldn't have as much hair loss." So if you don't want to change your hairstyle, or if you want to approach this from a more preventative perspective, I would definitely love to chat with you so we can look at not only are you getting the right nutrients in, but how well are you digesting those said nutrients. And then myth number 5 is that you can't get pregnant while you're breastfeeding. So we talk about family planning in my office, and I've heard this a number of times, right, where my practice members will say like, "Oh, it's okay. I'm not going to get pregnant because I'm breastfeeding." And this is actually not true. So while breastfeeding can certainly delay ovulation, it's not actually a reliable form of contraception in the sense that if you were hoping to postpone your next pregnancy, or if you don't want to get pregnant again, I would not necessarily just rely on whether or not you are breastfeeding as your sole method for that. If this has been helpful for you, I'd love to hear your comments and takeaways below. And feel free to look at the links for the face washing stretch along with some other stretches. Taking a moment, ideally once an hour for even a minute, to take the micro breaks for yourself to restore some of your health and well being can make really, really significant changes for you as a mom. So, congratulations, and we'll talk to you next week.